The first thing you notice is the light. Not the alarm, not the smell of coffee, not even the sound of paws clicking against the hardwood floor as she rounds the corner from the hallway. It is the light, that particular quality of late February morning. Light that feels different from January's flat, gray, softer somehow, carrying just the faintest suggestion of a promise it isn't quite ready to keep. You pull the curtain back, and the yard is still frost-covered, the grass pale and stiff, the bird feeder casting a long shadow across the patio. But something in the air has shifted, something molecular and quiet. And you feel it before you can name it. Boni is already at the door. She has been waiting, the way she always waits, with that particular patience that only dogs seem to have mastered. The kind that doesn't feel like waiting at all, but more like absolute certainty that the thing she wants is already on its way. You clip the leash, pull on your coat, and step outside together into the cold. And that is when you see it. You crouch down because something makes you want to look more closely, and you hold her face in your hands. The way you have 1,000 times before. And the nose that looks back at you is not the nose you remember. It was coal black in August. You are sure of it. You have photographs to prove it. Dozens of them on your phone. Boni at the lake. Boni in the backyard. Boni stretched across the porch in the full gold of a summer afternoon. And in every single one of them her nose is a deep, rich, definitive black. The kind of black that looks almost polished, almost deliberate. But the nose in your hands this February morning is something else entirely. It is dusty, muted, a pale pinkish gray that makes her look, you think, a little bit like a different dog, a little bit like a stranger wearing Boni's face. You feel the first flicker of something you don't want to name. Worry. If you are watching this right now, there is a good chance you know exactly that feeling. Maybe it happened to you this morning, or last week, or during the first warm weekend of March. When you finally got outside for a real walk, and the sun hit her face at just the right angle, and you thought, wait. Maybe your first instinct was to call the vet. Maybe you did call the vet, and they reassured you. But the reassurance didn't quite stick because they didn't really explain it. Not in a way that made the worry go away completely. Or maybe you went to the internet, and the internet gave you 17 different possibilities ranging from harmless to terrifying. And you closed the laptop feeling worse than when you started. We have all been there. And today, we are going to fix that. Here is what this video is going to give you. By the time we are done, you are going to understand exactly what is happening inside Boni's nose on a molecular level. And you are going to understand why it happens in late winter and early spring specifically. And not in October, and not in July. You are going to know the precise biological mechanism behind what scientists and veterinarians call snow nose. And you are going to know how to tell the difference, clearly and confidently, between a natural seasonal change and something that actually requires medical attention. You are going to walk away from this with a checklist, a framework, and a new way of seeing your dog that I genuinely believe will make you a better, calmer, more informed companion to her. But here is what I want to say before we get into any of that. Because I think it matters more than the science does. There is something about reaching a certain point in life, somewhere in your 40s or beyond, where the small changes in the things you love start to carry a weight they didn't used to carry. When you were younger, you noticed change, but you didn't always feel it. Now you feel it. You feel it when the seasons turn faster than they used to. You feel it when you look at your kids and realize they are suddenly taller than you remember. And you feel it when you look at your dog, this animal, who has been with you through so much, who was there on the hard days when not many people were. And you notice something different about her face, and the worry isn't just about the nose. The worry is about time. The worry is about all of it. I understand that. I want you to know that I understand that. And that is also why I want to be honest with you right from the start. Because you deserve that more than you deserve a neat story with no rough edges. The phenomenon we are talking about today, this seasonal fading of pigment in your dog's nose, is real, it is documented. and it is in the overwhelming majority of cases completely harmless. The leading scientific explanation is compelling and well supported, but I am also going to tell you where the science is still working things out, where the research is ongoing, and where we should hold our certainty loosely. Because that is what good information looks like, and you are smart enough to handle it. So let's begin. Let's go back to that February morning, back to the frost on the grass, and the pale quality of the light and Boni's face in your hands. Let's start there, and let's figure out what is actually happening. There is a particular stretch of late February that meteorologists describe in dry, technical language, the tail end of astronomical winter. The approach of meteorological spring, mean daily temperatures beginning their slow northward migration on the charts. But if you have spent any real time paying attention to the world, you know that the way those weeks actually feel has almost nothing to do with charts and numbers. They feel like holding your breath. They feel like standing in a doorway between two rooms, one still cold and dim, the other not quite warm yet but different, charged with a kind of quiet anticipation that the trees seem to feel in their roots before they bother telling their branches about it. It is during exactly this stretch, consistently and reliably, that dogs like Boni begin to show the change. The first accounts of snow nose in the veterinary literature appear scattered across the second half of the 20th century, documented largely through clinical observation rather than controlled study. Veterinarians in northern climates began noticing a pattern in breeds with naturally heavy pigmentation: Labrador Retrievers, Golden Retrievers, Bernese Mountain Dogs, Siberian Huskies, that the deep color of the nasal planum, which is the medical term for the surface of the nose, would fade reliably during the winter months and then, in many but not all cases, return to its original depth as the year warmed. The phenomenon was noted in the Merck Veterinary Manual and discussed in breed-specific health forums and kennel club publications throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Always with the same basic assessment: cosmetic, benign, and poorly understood. That last part, which is poorly understood, is important, and we will revisit it. But first, let's discuss what you actually see, because the visual experience of this change is something that owners describe with remarkable consistency. And I think there is real value in naming it accurately. The change does not announce itself. That is the first thing. It does not happen overnight in a way that would alarm you immediately and send you straight to the phone. It happens the way dusk happens, gradually enough that you can't quite point to the moment it began, but definitively enough that at some point you look up and realize the light is already gone. In early winter, you might notice that the nose looks slightly less saturated than you remember. But you tell yourself it is the lighting, or the angle, or the season, making everything look a little grayer. By February, the evidence is harder to argue with. What you typically see is a fading that begins at the edges and works inward. Or sometimes a lightening of the central stripe, that vertical crease that runs along the midline of the nose, before spreading outward to the lateral lobes. The black does not turn pink overnight. It transitions through a series of intermediate stages: deep brown, then a warm charcoal, then a cooler gray, then finally that dusty pinkish beige that sits so far from the original color that it genuinely looks like a different animal if you are not prepared for it. The pigment that remains is often patchy and uneven, darker in some spots, almost absent in others, giving the nose a mottled, watercolor quality that is, if you can set the worry aside for a moment, actually quite beautiful. The texture, and this is critical, does not change. We will return to this in much more detail in Chapter 4. But I want to plant the seed now because it is the single most important thing to understand about snow nose. The surface of Boni's nose should remain smooth, supple, and slightly moist. It should not crack. It should not crust. It should not develop raised or depressed areas. It should not bleed, and it should not cause her any discomfort. If the texture changes, we are in different territory. But if only the color changes, we are almost certainly looking at snow nose, and we are in good company. A 2019 survey conducted by veterinary dermatologist Drive Petra Bizikova through the North Carolina State University College of Veterinary Medicine, found that nasal depigmentation of the snow-nose variety was observed in a significant percentage of affected breeds during winter months, with Labrador Retrievers representing one of the most commonly reported populations. Now, here is something I want you to sit with for a moment, because I think it says something true about the experience of being a dog owner at a certain stage of life. When we are in our 20s, we notice things. When we are in our 40s and beyond, we notice things, and we remember. We have a reference point now. We have 5 summers of photographs, or 10, or 15. And we know what this animal looked like when we first brought her home, and we know what she looked like last July. And the distance between that memory and what we are looking at this February morning feels significant in a way it would not have felt to our younger selves. Part of what you are experiencing when you see Boni's nose and feel that flutter of concern is not just concern about the nose. It is the particular ache of loving something across time, of knowing that every change, even the harmless ones, is also a kind of marking. A small notch in the doorframe. Another measure of how much of this has already passed. That is not a small thing. And I don't think we should rush past it to get to the enzyme biology. Because the enzyme biology is going to mean more to you if you understand why you care about it so much in the first place. You care because Boni is not just a dog. She is a fixed point in a life that has had its share of things that didn't stay fixed. She is the one who was there at 6 in the morning when you couldn't sleep. She is the one who sat next to you on the couch during the hard year, whoever's hard year that was. And she didn't ask you to explain yourself or perform wellness or pretend things were fine. She just stayed, and you have learned to read her face the way you learn to read the faces of the people you love most, not through words, but through something older and more reliable, through the specific quality of her attention. The way she carries her ears when she is uncertain, the way her whole body becomes an exclamation point when something delights her. Her nose is part of that face. Of course, you noticed. Of course, you want to understand. So let's understand it together. We have established what snow nose looks like, how it progresses, and when it typically appears. In the next chapter, we are going to go inside, all the way down to the molecular level, and look at exactly what is happening in the tissue of that nose as February gives way to March. We are going to meet the enzyme that is responsible for all of this, and we are going to understand why something so small, a single protein doing its job inside a single animal's nose, can tell us something genuinely astonishing about the relationship between living things and the light they live inside. Stay with me. To understand what is happening inside Boni's nose, you have to be willing to travel somewhere most of us rarely go in our daily lives. You have to be willing to go small, not just small in the way we mean when we talk about cells, though we will get there, but small in the way that starts to feel almost philosophical. The kind of small where the familiar world dissolves into something that looks less like a dog's nose and more like a vast, humming, almost incomprehensibly complex landscape of chemical reactions happening simultaneously, constantly, without pause, without error, without any awareness at all. That the result of all that invisible labor is something as warm and specific and irreplaceable as the face of an animal you love. That is where we are going. And I promise it is worth the trip. Let's start with a word you have almost certainly heard before, even if you have never had reason to think much about it. Melanin. The word comes from the Greek, melos, meaning black or dark, and it refers to a family of natural pigments found across an extraordinary range of living organisms, from the dark bands on a butterfly's wing to the deep brown of a human eye to the rich black of a Labrador Retriever's nose on a hot August afternoon. Melanin is one of nature's oldest solutions to one of nature's oldest problems, which is what to do with light. Specifically, what to do with ultraviolet radiation, which is energetic enough to damage the delicate molecular machinery of living cells. If it is allowed to penetrate without resistance, melanin absorbs that energy. It intercepts the UV before it can reach the DNA beneath, and it dissipates the energy as heat, safely, efficiently, elegantly. It is, in the truest sense, a biological shield. In dogs, melanin is produced by specialized cells called melanocytes. These cells live in the skin and in the mucous membranes, and they are present in the tissue of the nasal planum, that exposed, pigmented surface of the nose that we have been talking about. Melanocytes are not passive, they are active manufacturers, running a continuous production line that takes raw biochemical materials and transforms them, through a precise sequence of steps, into the melanin granules that give Boni's nose its color. Those granules are then transferred into the surrounding tissue cells, where they accumulate and create the visual impression of deep, saturated pigmentation. Now here is where it gets interesting. Because the melanocytes themselves are not what runs this production line. They are the factory, but they are not the foreman. The foreman is an enzyme. The enzyme is called tyrosinase. Tyrosinase is a copper-containing oxidase, which means it is a protein that facilitates oxidation reactions and requires copper ions to do its work. It was first isolated and studied in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with significant early contributions from researchers including Hugo Raper and later J. B. S. Haldane's collaborators, whose work in the 1920s began to map the biochemical pathway, now known as the Raper-Mason pathway, the sequence of chemical reactions through which tyrosinase converts the amino acid tyrosine into the various forms of melanin. The pathway is elegant in the way that the best biological systems tend to be elegant, which is to say it accomplishes something extraordinarily complex through a series of steps that each look, in isolation, almost simple. Tyrosinase takes tyrosine, a common amino acid present in dietary protein, and catalyzes its conversion first into a compound called DOPA, which stands for dihydroxyphenylalanine, and then into DOP-equinone, a reactive intermediate that can proceed down different biochemical paths depending on the cellular environment. One path leads to eumelanin, which is the dark brown to black pigment responsible for the deep color in Boni's nose, her dark eyes, the black fur along her back. Another path leads to pheomelanin, a reddish-yellow pigment more commonly associated with lighter-colored animals. The ratio of these two forms of melanin, determined largely by genetic factors specific to each individual animal, is what gives each dog its particular coloration. In a healthy, genetically typical black Labrador Retriever, eumelanin production dominates, and tyrosinase drives that production efficiently and abundantly. The result, in summer, is a nose so dark it almost seems to absorb the light around it. So what changes in February? This is the part where the science is genuinely fascinating, and also the part where I want to be careful with you, because scientific honesty requires me to hold this explanation with appropriate precision. The leading hypothesis, and I use that word deliberately, is that tyrosinase is thermolabile, meaning that its activity is sensitive to temperature. Enzymes in general are not static structures. They are dynamic, three-dimensional proteins that change shape as conditions change around them. And that shape, that specific folded geometry, is what allows them to bind to their target molecules and catalyze their reactions. When temperature drops below the enzyme's optimal range, the protein's conformation changes subtly. Its active site becomes less precisely shaped, and its catalytic efficiency decreases. It doesn't stop working entirely. It just works more slowly, less productively, turning out fewer melanin granules per unit of time. The result, accumulated over weeks and months of reduced enzymatic activity, is a gradual depletion of the melanin in the surface tissue of the nasal planum. The existing pigment doesn't disappear overnight. Melanin granules are relatively stable once deposited in tissue. But as cells turn over naturally, as old tissue is replaced by new, the new tissue contains less melanin than the old did, because the production rate has slowed. And so the nose fades, not catastrophically, but incrementally, in that watercolor progression we described in Chapter 1. This hypothesis is supported by a body of circumstantial but compelling evidence. The fading occurs consistently during the coldest months and the period of lowest solar radiation. It reverses in many individuals during the warmer months when both temperature and UV exposure increase. It is most pronounced in breeds and individuals with the heaviest baseline pigmentation. Which makes sense if we think about it in terms of how far the production rate has to fall before the visual change becomes apparent. A lightly pigmented dog might not show a visible change even if tyrosinase activity drops by 30%. A deeply pigmented black lab will show the change quite clearly. There is also interesting comparative evidence from research on other mammals. A 2016 study published in the journal Pigment Cell and Melanoma Research examined temperature-dependent tyrosinase activity in Siamese cats, whose famous point coloration, darker on the ears, face, paws, and tail, is actually produced by a temperature-sensitive variant of the same enzyme. In Siamese cats, the tyrosinase variant is active only in the cooler extremities of the body, where the blood temperature is slightly lower than the core, which is why the pigment concentrates precisely in those areas. This is not exactly the same mechanism as snow nose, but it is a beautiful illustration of the principle that tyrosinase activity and temperature are genuinely, measurably linked, and that this link can produce visible, predictable changes in pigmentation. However, and this is where I want to be honest with you, the precise mechanism of snow nose in dogs has not been fully elucidated in the peer-reviewed literature. There are no large-scale, controlled clinical trials that have directly measured tyrosinase activity in canine nasal tissue across seasons and correlated it with observed pigmentation changes. The thermolabile hypothesis is the most coherent and well-supported explanation currently available, and it is the one that most veterinary dermatologists and canine genetics researchers cite when discussing this phenomenon. But it remains a hypothesis, not a confirmed mechanistic certainty. The 2019 work from Dr. Bizakova's group at NC State, which we referenced in the previous chapter, acknowledges this gap explicitly, noting that while the clinical pattern of snow nose is well documented, the underlying molecular cause has not been definitively established. I tell you this not to undermine the explanation, but because I think you deserve to know the difference between what we know and what we think we know. And I think that distinction, which science sometimes handles poorly when it reaches the general public, is one of the most important habits of mind any of us can cultivate. Now, there is a second factor that almost certainly plays a role alongside temperature, and that is light itself. Specifically, UV radiation. The relationship between UV exposure and melanin production is well established in a broad range of organisms. UV radiation triggers melanogenesis, the biological term for the process of melanin production, through several pathways, including direct stimulation of melanocyte activity and indirect signaling through keratinocytes, the surrounding skin cells, which release paracrine signals that upregulate tyrosinase expression in response to UV. In simpler terms, sunlight tells the body to make more melanin, and the body responds by increasing the activity of the enzyme that makes it. In late February, in most of the northern United States, the UV index is typically between 1 and 3, which the EPA categorizes as low. Compare this to July, when midday UV indices in the same regions routinely reach 8 to 10, categorized as very high, and you begin to understand why the summer nose and the winter nose look so different. It is not just that the body is producing less melanin because it is cold. It is also producing less melanin because the UV signal that says produce more is much quieter in February than it is in July. Both factors, the temperature sensitivity of tyrosinase and the reduced UV-driven stimulation of melanogenesis, are likely working in the same direction simultaneously, each contributing to the gradual fade we see as the year bottoms out and then begins its long turn back toward the light. There is something I find genuinely moving about this, and I want to name it before we move on. When you hold Boni's face in your hands on that February morning and look at her pale, dusty nose, you are looking at a record. You are looking at the accumulated effect of months of cold air and low sun, and shortened days, written in the tissue of her face, legible if you know the language. Her nose is not just a nose. It is a kind of biological journal, a document of the season. She has lived through recorded at the molecular level by an enzyme that has been doing this same work, responding to this same light and cold, for millions of years before Boni was born, before Labradors existed as a breed, before anyone had a name for any of it. There is a quality that comes with age, I think you know the one I mean, where you start to see the world in layers. Where a morning walk is not just a morning walk but also every morning walk you have ever taken. Where a dog's face contains not just the face in front of you, but all the faces it has been and all the faces it will become. That layered seeing is sometimes called wisdom, and sometimes called grief, and usually it is both at once. Looking at Boni's February nose with that kind of seeing means understanding that you are not looking at a problem to be solved. You are looking at a life being lived, fully and seasonally, and right on schedule, in all its particular, fleeting, unrepeatable beauty. The enzyme is just the mechanism. The meaning is yours to make. In the next chapter, we are going to zoom back out from the molecular level and look at the bigger picture. The relationship between Boni's internal biology and the external rhythm of the year. We are going to talk about why the fading happens on this particular schedule. Why February and March, and not October, and why the nose often stays light even after the first warm days of spring arrive. There is a concept in biology called a lag effect, and understanding it is going to make the timeline of snow nose make complete, satisfying sense. We are just getting started. There is a moment in early March that people who pay attention to the natural world know well, even if they have never found the words for it exactly. It arrives on an ordinary Tuesday, or a Sunday afternoon, or somewhere in the middle of a workday when you step outside for 10 minutes. And the air hits your face with something that is not quite warm but is no longer entirely cold either. It is a quality of light more than a temperature. A particular angle of the sun that casts shadows differently than it did a week ago, longer and softer, less stark. The birds seem to know it before you do. The crows are louder. The juncos that have been huddled at your feet all winter are suddenly restless, moving differently, as if something in them has received a signal and they are still deciding what to do with it. Boni knows it too, in her own way. She pulls harder at the leash on mornings like this, nose low to the frost-softened ground, reading something in the air that you will never be able to access directly but that you can almost feel the edges of when you watch her concentrate. The world is waking up. Everyone who has spent a winter in the northern half of this country knows the feeling of waking, the way it reaches inside you and moves something that the cold had pressed flat and still. And yet Boni's nose, on this same morning, is still pink. This is the thing that confuses people most, and it confused me, too, the first time I really sat down with the science of it. If snow nose is caused by cold temperatures and low light, then why doesn't it start recovering the moment the temperatures rise and the days get longer? Why does the nose stay faded well into March, sometimes into April, sometimes even later? Even when the weather is objectively improving, and the sun is genuinely stronger, and the whole world is visibly, undeniably moving in the direction of spring? The answer lives in a concept that biologists call the lag effect and understanding. It properly requires us to think about time in a slightly different way than we usually do. We tend to think of biological responses as relatively immediate. We touch something hot, and we pull our hand back. We eat something, and we feel satisfied. We go into the sun, and we tan. The stimulus arrives, and the response follows, in a sequence that feels tight and causal and close together in time. But many of the most important biological processes, particularly those that govern seasonal adaptation in animals, do not work this way at all. They work on a timescale that is measured not in seconds or minutes but in weeks, and the reason for this is deeply practical. Consider what it would mean for an animal's body to respond instantaneously to every fluctuation in temperature or daylight. A warm week in January in Boston, and there have been several in recent years, would trigger the full biological machinery of spring. A cold snap in late April would slam everything back into winter mode. The animal would be spending enormous metabolic resources lurching between states, never fully committed to either, always reacting to the most recent data point rather than the larger pattern. This is not a survivable strategy over evolutionary time. What animals need, what evolution has selected for across millions of years, is the ability to detect genuine seasonal change, the kind that is sustained and directional, not a temporary aberration, and to respond to that change on a schedule that matches the actual progression of the year. The biological systems that accomplish this are collectively referred to as circannual rhythms, from the Latin circa annum, meaning approximately a year. These are internal timing mechanisms that operate somewhat like a clock, cycling through states on an annual schedule and using environmental cues, particularly changes in photoperiod, which is the daily duration of light and temperature, to calibrate and adjust that internal schedule. They are found across an astonishing range of organisms, from migratory birds to hibernating mammals to flowering plants to, in more limited but real ways, domestic dogs. The key cue in most mammalian circannual systems is not temperature directly, but photoperiod. Light duration is a more reliable signal of seasonal position than temperature, which can vary wildly from year to year. The amount of daylight on March 15th is essentially the same every year, regardless of whether it is a warm winter or a cold one. The brain detects this signal through a specialized pathway involving the eyes, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, a tiny region of the hypothalamus that functions as the master circadian clock, and the pineal gland, which produces melatonin, a hormone whose secretion pattern encodes information about day length. When days are short, melatonin secretion is prolonged. When days lengthen, melatonin secretion shortens. The hypothalamus reads this melatonin signal and adjusts a cascade of downstream hormonal and enzymatic responses accordingly. In species with strongly photoperiod-driven biology, like deer or horses or certain breeds of sheep, this system orchestrates everything from reproductive cycles to coat growth to metabolic rate. In domestic dogs, the photoperiodic sensitivity is less dramatic, having been partially attenuated through thousands of years of artificial selection and year-round human care, but it has not disappeared. It remains present as a background regulatory influence on various biological processes, including, the evidence suggests, the melanogenic activity of the nasal melanocytes. Here is where the lag effect enters the picture. When the photoperiod signal begins to change, when the days start getting longer after the winter solstice on approximately December 21st, the brain does not immediately translate that signal into full biological spring mode. It cannot, because it does not yet know whether this lengthening is genuine and sustained or a temporary fluctuation. The system is conservative by design. It accumulates evidence over weeks, integrating the signal across time before committing to a large-scale biological response. This integration process, from the initial detection of lengthening days to the full downstream expression of a seasonal biological shift, takes approximately 6 to 8 weeks in many mammalian systems, sometimes longer. Apply this timeline to Boni's nose, and the sequence becomes clear and logical. The winter solstice arrives in late December. Tyrosinase activity is at its seasonal low, melatonin secretion is at its seasonal high, UV radiation is minimal, and ambient temperature is near its annual floor. The days begin lengthening immediately after the solstice, but the biological systems don't respond immediately. They begin accumulating evidence. Through January, the photoperiod signal is strengthening, but the response is lagging. Through February, the signal is clearer, but the 6 to 8 week integration period means the downstream effects are only beginning to express. The temperatures are still cold, the UV index is still low, and tyrosinase activity remains suppressed, even as the signal that will eventually reverse that suppression is being processed somewhere upstream. By late February and early March, the internal clock is genuinely beginning to respond. But the full reactivation of melanogenic activity takes additional time, because enzyme upregulation itself is not instantaneous. The cells must receive the signal, translate it into gene expression, produce new tyrosinase protein, and accumulate enough enzyme activity to generate visible increases in melanin production. Each step in that cascade adds time. The result is that even as the weather turns and the light improves, and the birds get restless and Boni pulls harder at the leash, her nose stays pale, still carrying the visible signature of a winter that, biologically speaking, her body has not yet fully registered as over. This is the lag effect. And it is not a malfunction. It is the system working exactly as it was designed to work. Integrating signals across time, committing to seasonal transitions only when the evidence is sustained and genuine, protecting the animal from the metabolic cost of false starts. There is a related phenomenon that I find particularly worth noting here, because it speaks to something beyond the biology. Researchers studying circannual rhythms have documented what they call a memory component in these systems, meaning that the body does not simply respond to present conditions but appears to maintain a kind of accumulated record of recent photoperiodic history. A study published in the Journal of Biological Rhythms in 2014 by researchers at the University of Manchester, examining seasonal hormonal rhythms in sheep, found that the circannual system's response to current light conditions was significantly modulated by the pattern of light conditions over the preceding several weeks. In other words, where you are in the season is not just a function of today's daylight duration. It is a function of the entire recent trajectory, where you have been, how fast you have been moving, and what the pattern looks like across time. Boni's nose, in this light, is not just a snapshot of the present moment. It is a summary of the recent past. It carries, in its degree of pigmentation, a kind of compressed record of the last several weeks of light and temperature, weighted and integrated by biological systems that have been solving this particular problem for far longer than any of us have been alive to observe them. I want to stay with this idea for a moment, because I think it resonates with something that people who have reached a certain point in their lives understand, in a way that younger people don't always have access to yet. We carry our history in our faces, too, not encoded in melanin exactly, but in the lines around our eyes, and the particular way we hold our mouths and the specific quality of tiredness or ease that sits in our expression at the end of a long day. The people who have known us longest can read those things. They know what we looked like before a particular year took something out of us. They know what ease looks like on our face versus what performance of ease looks like, and they can tell the difference. Even when we think we are being convincing, we are legible to the people who love us, whether we mean to be or not. Boni is legible to you in the same way. Her February nose is not a mystery or a warning. It is a record. It says winter was long. It says the light was low. It says the enzyme did what the enzyme does when the conditions call for it. And it says all of this in a language written in pigment that you can read with your own eyes if you know what you are looking at. And now you do. There is also something worth saying here about the forward momentum of this process, because I do not want to leave you with the impression that the lag is purely a delay, a kind of biological reluctance. It is better understood as a form of momentum. The circannual clock, once it has committed to a seasonal direction, does not easily reverse. The accumulated photoperiodic signal, integrated over weeks, creates a kind of inertia that carries the biological systems forward, even through temporary reversals in weather. This is why a cold snap in April, after several weeks of genuine warming, does not immediately send Boni's nose back toward pink. The clock has turned. The trajectory is set. The enzyme activity is climbing. A week of cold rain will not undo 6 weeks of building a photoperiodic signal. This also means that the recovery of Boni's nose color, once it begins, tends to proceed with its own quiet steadiness. You will not usually see the black return dramatically overnight. You will see it the way you saw it leave, incrementally, the deepening beginning at the center and working outward, or appearing first in one region and spreading gradually across the surface, until one morning in May or June, you look at her face in the full morning sun and realize that the coal-black nose has returned, and you cannot precisely say when it happened, only that it has. In some individuals, particularly older dogs, the recovery is less complete. This is an important thing to understand, and we will address it more fully in the next chapter. when we talk about how to distinguish normal snow nose from changes that might warrant veterinary attention. For now, it is enough to say that the degree of seasonal recovery tends to correlate with age and with the individual animal's baseline melanogenic capacity, which, like many biological capacities, tends to diminish gradually over time. A 7-year-old lab may not get all the way back to the depth of black she had at 2. This is not a disease. This is the slower, quieter version of the same process that puts gray in our own hair and softens the lines of our own faces, and makes us look, to the people who have known us longest, a little different than we used to, and also, in ways that are harder to articulate, a little more like ourselves. The clock turns for all of us. The lag is just the body's way of making sure the turn is real before it commits. In the next chapter, we are going to move from the poetic to the practical. Because everything we have learned so far about tyrosinase and photoperiod and lag effects is most valuable when it helps you make good decisions as a caregiver. We are going to build that checklist I promised you in the intro, the one that will let you look at any change in Boni's nose with confidence and clarity, and know, without panic and without guesswork, exactly what you are looking at and exactly what, if anything, you need to do about it. That is where we are going next. And it is where the science starts to become, in the most direct and practical sense, an act of love. There is a specific kind of worry that comes with caring for another living creature across many years. One that is different in quality from the worry you feel about new things. When Boni was a puppy, the worry was loud and immediate, sharp-edged and easily named. Is she eating enough? Is that cough serious? Did she get into something in the backyard? Those early worries had a certain urgency to them, a brightness, almost, the way new things tend to be bright even when they are frightening. You acted quickly because you didn't yet know what was normal, and the uncertainty itself propelled you toward the phone, toward the vet, toward any source of information that might tell you whether this was something or nothing. The worry that comes later, after years of knowing an animal, is quieter and in some ways more difficult to carry. It is not the sharp worry of the unfamiliar. It is the low, persistent worry of someone who knows exactly what normal looks like and is watching, very carefully, for the first sign that normal has shifted. It is the worry of attention, of accumulated knowledge, of love that has grown specific and deeply calibrated to this one creature over a long period of time. It is, in its own way, one of the most profound forms of caring there is. And it deserves to be taken seriously, not dismissed, not minimized, but met with the clearest and most honest information available. That is what this chapter is for. We have spent the last 3 chapters building a foundation of understanding, the visual progression of snow nose, the molecular mechanism of tyrosinase and melanin, the circannual rhythms, and lag effects that explain the timing. All of that knowledge has a purpose beyond intellectual satisfaction, though intellectual satisfaction is itself a worthy thing. Its purpose is to give you a framework, a reliable internal reference, that allows you to look at Boni's changing nose and make a genuinely informed assessment. Not a panicked one, not a dismissive one, an informed one. So let's build that framework carefully and completely, because you deserve to walk away from this chapter with something concrete in your hands. The single most important distinction in assessing nasal changes in your dog is one we have touched on before. And it bears repeating with the full emphasis it deserves. The distinction is this: snow nose is a color change only. Everything else about the nose, its texture, its moisture level, its surface integrity, its sensitivity, its relationship to Boni's overall behavior and well-being, remains entirely normal. If the color is the only thing that has changed, the probability that you are looking at snow nose is very high, and the probability that you are looking at something requiring medical intervention is very low. If anything other than color has changed, the calculus shifts. And that is what we need to understand in detail. Let's start with texture, because it is the most immediately accessible thing to assess and one of the most diagnostically significant. A healthy dog's nasal planum has a characteristic feel that experienced owners know intuitively: slightly cool, subtly moist, with a finely textured surface that has a quality almost like soft leather, supple and continuous, without ridges or cracks or areas of unusual hardness or softness. Run your thumb gently across Boni's nose. What you are feeling for is continuity. The surface should feel consistent from edge to edge, without breaks. Without raised areas that feel thickened or crusty, without depressed areas that feel eroded or raw. Hyperkeratosis, a condition in which the surface of the nose becomes abnormally thickened and develops a crusty, almost barnacle-like texture, can occur in dogs for a variety of reasons, including nutritional deficiencies, autoimmune conditions, and certain viral infections. It is not the same as snow nose, and it does not look or feel like snow nose. The surface integrity is compromised. The texture is wrong. In hyperkeratosis, the nose may appear fissured, with deep cracks that can sometimes bleed or become secondarily infected. The color change in hyperkeratosis, if present, is often secondary to the textural change rather than independent of it. And the overall appearance is one of pathology rather than the clean, smooth, simply paler surface of a snow-nosed nose. Nasal hyperkeratosis has been documented extensively in veterinary dermatology literature, including a comprehensive review published in Veterinary Dermatology in 2018 by Dr. Rosanna Marcella of the University of Florida College of Veterinary Medicine, which identified idiopathic nasal hyperkeratosis, meaning hyperkeratosis without an identifiable underlying cause, as a distinct clinical entity most commonly seen in older dogs of several breeds, including Labrador Retrievers. If you're looking at Boni's nose and the texture concerns you, if it feels rough or hard or uneven in ways it did not used to feel, that is worth a conversation with your veterinarian, regardless of what the color is doing. The second thing to assess is moisture. A healthy nose is neither soaking wet nor bone dry. It maintains a baseline level of moisture that serves several functional purposes. Most importantly, enhancing the olfactory surface's ability to capture scent molecules from the air. A nose that is dramatically drier than usual, persistently, rather than temporarily, can indicate dehydration, respiratory infection, or, in some cases, autoimmune disease. This is different from the mild surface dryness that can occur after a long nap or after prolonged exposure to dry winter air, both of which are entirely normal and self-correcting. What you are looking for is a pattern of persistent, pronounced dryness that does not resolve on its own and is accompanied by other signs of change. Conversely, excessive moisture or discharge from the nasal area, particularly if it is colored, cloudy, or asymmetrical, meaning more prominent from one nostril than the other, is also worth noting. This is generally unrelated to snow nose but falls into the category of nasal changes that deserve attention. The third assessment point is surface integrity, which overlaps with texture but is worth distinguishing. What you are looking for here is any break in the continuity of the nasal surface, any area that looks eroded, ulcerated, raw, or that has lost the normal pigmented tissue and replaced it with something that looks like exposed pink flesh rather than the smooth pale surface of depigmentation. Ulceration is a significant finding. It is not snow nose. Conditions that can cause nasal ulceration include discoid lupus erythematosus, which is an autoimmune skin condition that has a particular predilection for the nasal planum in dogs, as well as pemphigus foliaceus, another autoimmune condition, and, in rare cases, certain fungal infections or neoplastic processes. Discoid lupus erythematosus, often abbreviated DLE, deserves specific attention, because it is probably the condition most likely to be confused with snow nose in its early stages. Both involve depigmentation of the nasal planum, but the clinical picture diverges quickly on close examination. In DLE, the depigmentation is typically accompanied by a loss of the normal cobblestone texture of the nasal surface, which becomes smooth and shiny in a way that is distinctly abnormal. The margin between pigmented and depigmented tissue often has an irregular, eroded quality. There may be redness, scaling, crusting, or ulceration, particularly as the condition progresses. The dog may show signs of discomfort when the nose is touched. Exposure to UV radiation characteristically worsens DLE, which means the condition tends to be more severe in summer. Rather than improving with warmer weather, the opposite pattern from snow nose. A 2017 retrospective study published in the journal Veterinary Dermatology, authored by researchers at the University of California Davis School of Veterinary Medicine, reviewed 210 cases of confirmed canine DLE and found that nasal depigmentation was present in 94% of cases, making it the most consistent clinical sign, but that ulceration, erosion, or surface texture abnormality was present in 78% of cases, providing a clear basis for clinical differentiation from benign seasonal depigmentation in the majority of affected animals. The study also noted that breeds with heavy facial pigmentation, including Labrador Retrievers, were represented in the affected population, reinforcing the importance of not assuming that depigmentation in these breeds is always benign. The fourth thing to assess is the geographic distribution of the color change. Snow nose is confined to the nasal planum. It does not extend to the lips, the muzzle skin, the skin around the eyes, or the mucous membranes of the mouth. It is a nose-specific phenomenon. If you are seeing depigmentation spreading beyond the nose to involve the lips, the periocular skin, the oral mucosa, or other areas of the face or body, that is a pattern inconsistent with snow nose and consistent with a broader depigmentation process that warrants investigation. Conditions to consider in this broader pattern include vitiligo, which is an autoimmune condition causing patchy depigmentation in multiple locations, uveidermatological syndrome, a rare but serious condition involving both eye inflammation and skin depigmentation that has been documented in several breeds, and certain systemic conditions that can affect pigmentation as a secondary manifestation. The fifth and perhaps most holistic assessment point is behavioral. Boni should not know that her nose is a different color. Snow nose is, by every account in the veterinary literature, entirely asymptomatic. There is no pain, no itching, no discomfort, no functional impairment of any kind. Boni should be eating normally, sleeping normally, and engaging with you and her environment with her usual level of interest and energy. She should not be pawing at her nose, rubbing her face on the carpet or furniture, showing any signs of facial discomfort when you touch the area, or displaying any behavior change that might suggest something is bothering her. If she is showing any of those signs, something is bothering her, and it is not snow nose. Let me put all of this into the checklist format. I promised you, because I think it is useful to have it stated plainly and simply, in language you can return to whenever you need it. When you look at Boni's nose and notice a color change, ask yourself the following. First, is the color change the only change? Second, is the surface texture still smooth, supple, and continuous, without cracks, crust, thickening, or erosion? Third, is the moisture level within her normal range, neither dramatically drier nor wetter than usual? Fourth, is the depigmentation confined to the nasal planum, without spreading to the lips, periocular skin, or other facial regions? Fifth, is the color change bilateral and relatively symmetrical, affecting both sides of the nose in a similar pattern, rather than being strongly one-sided? And sixth, is Boni herself entirely unbothered, eating well, sleeping well, showing no signs of facial discomfort or behavioral change? If the answer to all 6 of those questions is yes, you are almost certainly looking at snow nose, and you can breathe. You can go back inside, pour the coffee that has been getting cold on the counter, and sit with the knowledge that what you are witnessing is not a crisis, but a season, written in the most intimate possible script across the face of an animal who trusts you completely. If the answer to any of those questions is no, that is not cause for panic, but it is cause for a phone call. Not an emergency, middle-of-the-night phone call in most cases, but a thoughtful, scheduled conversation with your veterinarian, in which you describe what you are seeing and ask them to take a look. Bring photographs if you can, ideally a series showing the progression over several weeks. Because the temporal pattern of the change is one of the most useful pieces of information a veterinarian can have. A change that has been gradual and consistent over 2 months tells a very different story from one that appeared suddenly over 3 days. I want to add one more thing here, because it matters. And because I think it speaks directly to the kind of person who is still watching at this point in the video. The fact that you noticed this, that you paid close enough attention to Boni's face to see a subtle change in the color of her nose, and to take it seriously enough to seek understanding, is nothing. It is, in fact, exactly the kind of attention that makes the difference in an animal's life. The changes that matter, the ones that are caught early enough to treat effectively, are almost always caught first by someone who was paying the kind of careful, loving attention that you are paying. Veterinary medicine depends on owners like you, not the ones who notice everything and panic about everything, and not the ones who notice nothing until something is impossible to ignore, but the ones who notice things clearly, think about them carefully, and bring good information to the conversation. You are that person. The fact that you are here, working through the science of this, building a framework for understanding rather than just waiting for someone to tell you whether to worry or not, tells me that about you clearly. Boni is lucky, and the evidence is in how carefully you are looking at her face. In our final chapter, we are going to shift from assessment to action, from understanding to care. We are going to talk about what you can do, practically and specifically, to support Boni through this seasonal transition and into the months ahead. We are going to talk about sun protection for lighter noses, about what the research says regarding nutritional support for melanogenic function, and about how to think about this annual cycle. Not as something that happens to Boni, but as something you move through together, season by season, each year. Adding another layer to the particular, irreplaceable knowledge of each other that is the deepest thing a long companionship can offer. We are almost at the end, and the end, I think you will find, is actually a beginning. There is a photograph I want you to imagine taking. Not a posed one. Not the kind where you call her name and wait for her to look at the camera and then capture the moment she turns toward you, with her ears lifted and her expression alert and cooperative. Not that kind. I mean the other kind. The one you take when she doesn't know you're watching, when she is standing at the edge of the yard in the early morning light of a day in late March. Nose low to the ground, following something invisible through the frost-softened grass, her whole body organized around the act of attention. The light is coming in low and lateral, the way March light does. And it catches the pale surface of her nose and makes it almost luminous, that dusty pinkish gray catching the gold of the early sun in a way the coal-black summer nose never quite does. Take that photograph, not because you need to document a problem, not as evidence for the veterinarian, not as a before picture in a recovery story. Take it because it is beautiful. Take it because this exact version of Boni's face, this particular pale-nosed, frost-breath, early spring version of her, exists for only a few weeks every year. And then it is gone, replaced by the summer version who will be equally beautiful and equally temporary and equally worth your full attention. Take it because learning to see the seasonal version of someone you love, rather than measuring every change against some fixed ideal of how they are supposed to look, is one of the quiet skills of a long companionship, and like most quiet skills, it rewards practice. This chapter is about that practice. It is about what you do with everything we have learned, how you carry it forward into the coming months, how you translate understanding into care in the most specific and practical sense. But it is also about something larger than sun protection and dietary supplements, though we will get to both of those things. It is about a way of being with an animal across time, that I believe is only available to people who have been paying careful attention for long enough to understand what they are actually seeing. Let's start with the practical, because the practical is also an expression of love. As Boni's nose lightens, its capacity to protect itself from ultraviolet radiation diminishes along with the melanin that provides that protection. This is not a dramatic vulnerability. She is not going to suffer acute sunburn on a cloudy March morning, but it is a real consideration. Particularly as the spring sun strengthens and the UV index climbs through March and April toward the genuinely significant levels of late spring and early summer. The UV index in most Northern American cities reaches the moderate range, a score of 3 to 5, by mid to late March, and the high range, 6 to 7, by May. For a nose that is substantially depigmented, that represents meaningful UV exposure to unprotected tissue. The practical recommendation from veterinary dermatologists is straightforward and worth taking seriously. On days when Boni will spend extended time outdoors, particularly between the hours of 10 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon when UV radiation is most intense, apply a pet-safe sunscreen to the surface of her nose. The emphasis on pet-safe is not a marketing distinction but a genuine safety concern. Human sunscreens frequently contain zinc oxide, which is highly effective at blocking UV radiation in people but is toxic to dogs if ingested, causing gastrointestinal disturbance, hemolytic anemia, and, in significant exposures, serious systemic illness. Dogs lick their noses constantly. Whatever you put on the surface of that nose is going directly into Boni's mouth, repeatedly, throughout the day. It must be safe to ingest. There are several veterinary-formulated sunscreen products available that are specifically designed for application to canine nasal tissue. Your veterinarian can recommend a specific product appropriate for Boni's needs. Some owners also use products formulated for human infants that are free of zinc oxide and other problematic ingredients, but even in this case, a conversation with your veterinarian before application is the right approach, because formulations change, and what was considered safe last year may have been revised. The American College of Veterinary Dermatology maintains updated guidance on topical product safety for dogs, and your veterinarian will have access to current recommendations. The application does not need to be elaborate. A small amount, gently rubbed across the surface of the nasal planum with a fingertip, repeated every 2 to 3 hours during extended outdoor activity, is sufficient in most cases. Many dogs tolerate this easily once they are accustomed to it. A few find the initial application startling, particularly if the product has a scent they find unusual, and a gentle introduction over several days. Pairing the application with something Boni enjoys, a small treat, a brief massage behind the ears, a few minutes of quiet together, will typically resolve any initial resistance. Some owners find that a lightweight, breathable buff or bandana loosely arranged to shade the nose during peak sun hours, on hiking days, or long outdoor excursions, provides additional protection without the need for repeated reapplication. This works better for some dogs than others, depending on temperament, but it is worth mentioning as an option for particularly active individuals who spend long summer days in direct sun. Now let's talk about nutrition, because there is a genuinely interesting intersection between what Boni eats and how her melanogenic system functions. Though here again I want to be careful to represent the evidence accurately rather than overstate it. Tyrosinase, as we discussed in Chapter 2, is a copper-containing enzyme. Its activity depends on the availability of copper ions in the cellular environment. Copper is an essential trace mineral in canine nutrition, required not only for melanin synthesis but for a range of other biological functions, including iron metabolism, connective tissue formation, and neurological function. The National Research Council's 2006 publication, Nutrient Requirements of Dogs and Cats, established a recommended allowance for copper in adult dogs of 1.83 milligrams per kilogram of dry matter in the diet, a figure that most commercial complete and balanced dog foods are formulated to meet or exceed. In a dog eating a nutritionally complete commercial diet, copper deficiency, significant enough to impair tyrosinase activity, would be unusual, and supplementing copper beyond what the diet already provides is not recommended without specific guidance from a veterinarian. As copper toxicity is a real concern in dogs, particularly in certain breeds with copper metabolism disorders. I mention this not to suggest that you should start adding copper supplements to Boni's bowl, but because you may encounter this recommendation in various online forums, and I want you to have the context to evaluate it critically. What the nutritional research does support, more broadly, is the relationship between overall metabolic health and the efficiency of enzyme-dependent biological processes. A dog who is eating a high-quality, nutritionally complete diet, maintaining a healthy body weight, getting appropriate exercise, and managing any underlying health conditions well is going to support all of her biological systems, including her melanogenic system, more effectively than one whose nutrition or health is compromised in other ways. This is not a specific snow-nose intervention. It is simply the foundation of good care, and it matters here as it matters everywhere. There has been some interest in the role of antioxidants, particularly vitamin E, in supporting skin and coat health in dogs, and a few small studies have examined antioxidant supplementation in the context of canine dermatological conditions. The evidence base is modest, and the findings are mixed, and I would be overstating the case to suggest that vitamin E supplementation has a proven effect on snow-nose specifically. What can be said is that vitamin E plays a role in skin cell membrane integrity and in modulating inflammatory responses in the skin, and that ensuring adequate dietary vitamin E through a complete and balanced diet is a reasonable practice for overall skin and coat health. Again, supplementation beyond dietary levels should be discussed with your veterinarian, who can assess whether it is appropriate for Boni individually. I also want to say something here about the relationship between Boni's nose color and her identity as a dog in your family, because I think there is a psychological dimension to this seasonal cycle that is worth naming directly. For some owners, the return of the coal-black summer nose becomes a kind of annual milestone, a marker of the season's turn, something anticipated and welcomed in the way you might welcome other signs of summer's arrival. The first firefly, the first morning warm enough to have coffee on the porch without a jacket, the sound of the neighbor's kids in the pool next door. There is real joy in noticing that the nose is darkening again, in comparing this year's photographs with last year's, in tracking the progression, in sharing the update with other people who love this dog and understand why it matters. I want to encourage that joy, and I want to encourage you to share it in the broader community of people who love dogs the way you love Boni. The comment section of this channel, and the broader community of dog owners who gather in the various online spaces devoted to Labrador Retrievers and other breeds affected by snow-nose, is full of people who are doing exactly what you have been doing today, trying to understand what they are seeing, trying to care well, trying to be present to the particular seasonal life of an animal they have loved for a long time. Your photographs, your observations, your questions, your hard-won understanding, all of it has value to that community. Please share it. There is something that happens when you share careful attention with others who are paying the same kind of attention. It multiplies. It creates a collective body of observation that exceeds what any individual could accumulate alone. The citizen science of dog ownership, which sounds like a small thing but is actually a remarkable distributed research project conducted by millions of people across decades, has contributed meaningfully to what veterinarians and researchers understand about breed-specific health patterns, about seasonal variation in clinical presentations, and about the behavioral and physiological norms of dogs living in close partnership with humans. Your photograph of Boni's February nose, shared with care and context, is a small contribution to that larger understanding. And then there is this. As the weeks move forward from March into April, and from April into the expanding warmth of May, you are going to watch the change reverse itself. It will happen the same way it happened in the other direction, gradually, incrementally, without a clear beginning that you can point to. You will notice one morning that the center of her nose looks darker than it did last week, and then a week later, the margins will have followed, and then one afternoon in the full gold of a May evening you will look at her face, and the nose will be almost back to what it was, deep and rich and definitive, coal black in the slant light, and you will feel something hard to name exactly. It is not quite relief, because you understood all along that the pale nose was not a crisis. It is no surprise, because you knew this recovery was coming. It is something closer to the feeling of watching a story you already know reach its resolution anyway, and finding that knowing the ending does not diminish the satisfaction of the arrival. It is the feeling of a circle closing, of a year completing one of its many smaller cycles within the larger one, of witnessing again something you have witnessed before and finding it no less affecting for the repetition. That feeling is available to you every spring for as long as Boni is with you. And the years she is with you are, from this particular vantage point, one of the most precious quantities you possess. Do not spend them worrying about things that are not worth your worry. Save the worry for the things that deserve it. Apply it precisely and usefully in the way that this video has tried to equip you to do, and then set it down. Let the rest be what it is. Let the February nose be pale. Let the June nose be black. Let the cycle turn the way it has always turned. And let yourself be present to it, really present, in the full and particular way that only comes from understanding what you are seeing. That understanding is what you have now, and that is not a small thing. We began this morning with frost on the grass and a question you didn't know how to answer, standing in the cold with Boni's pale face in your hands. Feeling that flutter of worry that comes from loving something carefully across a long stretch of time. And we have traveled a considerable distance since then, from the surface of a dog's nose down to the molecular machinery of a single enzyme, from the biology of a single animal out to the grand circannual rhythms that govern the lives of creatures across the whole northern hemisphere, and back again. Always back again, to this specific dog, this specific morning, this specific relationship between you and an animal who has no idea that her nose is doing anything unusual and simply wants to know if you are ready to walk. Here is what I want you to take with you. Tyrosinase is real. The thermolabile hypothesis is compelling and well supported, though not yet definitively proven at the mechanistic level. The circannual rhythms that create the lag between changing seasons and changing noses are documented and understood. The checklist for distinguishing snow nose from conditions that require medical attention is clear: 6 questions. All of which should be answered yes before you settle into the comfortable certainty that what you are looking at is benign. The practical guidance on sun protection and nutrition is grounded in veterinary science and worth implementing thoughtfully. All of that is real and useful and worth carrying forward. But here is the thing I most want you to remember. The thing that I hope stays with you longer than the name of the enzyme or the number of the UV index. Paying this kind of attention to the creature in your care. The kind of attention that notices subtle changes and seeks to understand them. The kind that distinguishes between worry that needs action and worry that needs only understanding. The kind that can look at a pale February nose and see it clearly as both a biological event and a moment of beauty, is not a small or ordinary thing. It is one of the highest expressions of what it means to share your life with another creature. It is what love looks like when it has had time to become knowledge. Boni does not have the words to tell you that she is fine, that the pale nose is just the winter, doing what the winter does, that everything inside her is working exactly as it should be. She cannot offer you the reassurance that you sometimes need in the early morning hours when the worry is loudest. But she has given you something else, something that in many ways is more durable than reassurance. She has given you years of herself, years of mornings and seasons and small unrepeatable moments that have accumulated in you the way melanin accumulates in tissue, gradually and continuously. And without fanfare, until one day you look up and realize that you know this creature in a way that goes beyond words. That you can read her face the way you read the faces of the people you have loved longest. That knowledge is yours. No season takes it away. Take the photograph this morning. The pale nose in the low March light. Boni's breath visible in the cold air. The frost-softened yard stretching behind her. Take it and keep it, not as evidence of a problem but as a record of a season. A document of one February in the long, particular, irreplaceable story of the two of you. Spring is coming. The enzyme is already waking up. The nose will darken when it is ready, on its own schedule, in its own time. And you will be there to see it, as you have always been there, paying attention, understanding what you are seeing, caring well. That is everything. That is all of it. See you in the next one.